I want to begin by making a very minor announcement. Do you remember those series of posters that DCD put out back in the 1980s?
Yes, we have them on.
You're selling or giving away those giveaways?
With membership.
With membership? Good idea, good incentive. One thing that is not widely known is that on the backs of each of those posters I wrote an essay that kind of described the history of each area. So if they got hung, they went away forever. It was like doing an etching on the back of a postage stamp. so if you want a guaranteed anonymity, right in the back of a poster. And the artist, Jan Gurda, and I have been talking for a number of years about turning those into a book. And we finally approached a group called Historic Milwaukee, Inc. You all know them from Spaces and Traces, which has been at the Heights, as well as Doors Open, which is in its third year this September. And they agreed to be the nonprofit sponsor, the publisher, and we have raised the funds to make that project a reality. And it will be a book called Milwaukee City of Neighborhoods. And our goal is to have that out probably the first quarter of next year. And what that means, first of all, is that part of my job in the last number of months has been to update information that goes back to the 1980s. The world changes, neighborhoods change, the city changes. And that's been an awful lot of fun for me, and I spent the first couple of days of this week in the Heights, on my bike, poking around. Other things you can do to kind of update yourself, but there's no substitute for being on the ground. Talk a little bit more about what I found poking around, but I'll make the observation that that poster series had something to do with the name of this organization. We knew that there was a neighborhood that had a strongly defined sense of place west of Washington Park. It's so clear. On a larger scale, but it's sort of like Merrill Park or Pigsville, where your geography really sets apart Washington Heights. 60th, 47th, North, and Valete are the pretty obvious borders. But what do you call it? St. Seb's is what it was called by many people, but that did not do a whole lot for the Lutherans, going to Mount Olive or St. James. Some people called it Park West, but there was also a freeway called Park West, so that didn't quite fit. Another one was High Mount, but there's a whole lot more than High Mount in Washington Heights. So we kind of racked our brains, and the solution was to, in almost like a branding exercise in business. Here you are, the spine is Washington Boulevard between Washington Park and Washington Highlands, so why not call it Washington Heights? And that's where that came from. So put on the poster, and obviously it's taken, I guess you could say. It's certainly taken. And that's been a gratifying part of that entire series. So I want to talk about where the Heights came from, but to understand where you are today, just as you look back in time, you have to look back in place when you're looking at a neighborhood's history. In the case of Washington Heights, you've got to go all the way back to downtown Milwaukee. And you think about neighborhoods, they're kind of this constellation of stars, but it begins as a big bang downtown. And that's true of every American city, every city anywhere. They kind of begin at one common center, one sort of mass of energy, and it kind of hurtles outward in all directions, except in Milwaukee's case, but east, because there's water out there in the east. But the patterns are that the older sections of town tend to cast shadows, tend to have a formative influence on what goes on later on and farther out. And it's pretty self-evident. But there is no better example of that than some of the patterns you see on Milwaukee's west side. And certainly the area west of the Central Library, and that's kind of where Paul and I hang out a lot, certainly a core of development in Milwaukee's west side. You have two threads on Milwaukee's west side divided at roughly Wisconsin Avenue. And to simplify, maybe oversimplify, working class south of Wisconsin Avenue, wealthy on Wisconsin and north. Those are the patterns, and they have been since the mid-1800s. So you've got almost like strata in a geographic column or a geological column. There's sort of these layers of stone that are there in the human environment as well. So if you think of, first of all, and I'll touch on it lightly, that working class thread begins around the 3rd Ward, the Irish settlement back in the mid-1800s, a very working class settlement. And they kind of spread west to what was the 4th Ward, right around where the public service building is downtown. That was St. Gall's Church, which was the Irish parish in the mid-1800s. They moved farther out, again, south of Wisconsin Avenue, and developed a neighborhood called Torrey Hill. And I was pleased to see that they put the name on the Market Interchange. Just a little street there, kind of a connector underneath the interchange. But that was actually a very intact Irish neighborhood in the shadow of Jesu Church. And you think of Jesu as being kind of the parish or the campus church for Marquette U. That was an active Irish parish with its own school, one of the biggest schools in the Milwaukee Archdiocese. And the men in Torrey Hill worked in Valley Industries, and the women often worked as domestics in the mansions up on Grand Avenue. So kind of upstairs, downstairs, going on right on Milwaukee's west side. Marquette actually began on 10th and State back in 1881. That's why they're called the Hilltoppers. The hill there where the safety building is. And then did not move to Grand Avenue, Wisconsin Avenue, until 1907. And then pushing farther west, the next step out was Merrill Park, 27th, 35th, Wisconsin in the Valley. They established St. Rose back in 1888. And the next step out is Pigsville, the foot of the valley there. And where Merrill Park was quite heavily Irish with some German, the Pigsville neighborhood was largely Slavic, especially Slovaks. You follow that thread, you keep on following that thread out to West Allis, this industrial suburb, and think about how different West Allis is from Wauwatosa. You're right across 94. That's entirely a result of the historical patterns. So that's the southern thread, the working class thread. The wealthier thread extends from 9th and Wisconsin all the way out to the town of Brookfield, 15 miles and more than a century of urban development. And it begins right down there on 9th and Wisconsin, which was the home of a guy named Alexander Mitchell. Mitchell Street, Mitchell Field, Mitchell Park, it's all the same guy. He was, came from Scotland and was the richest Wisconsinite of his entire generation. And what is now the Wisconsin Club on 9th and Wisconsin was his house. So that was a single family home. And that set the tone for the development of the west side of downtown as a Gold Coast, equivalent to Prospect Avenue on the east side. So each of these sides had their own zones of affluent settlement. And early on, what's now Wisconsin Avenue had been called Spring Street. 1876, they changed the name to Grand Avenue. And it was absolutely descriptive of what was going on there. You had these grand homes on the avenue, anchored by Mitchells, but going on out to the Pabst Mansion at 20th, Brumders, Plankinton's, Wells, all kinds of other mansions that are long gone, but that was the character of settlement on West Wisconsin Avenue. And then you follow that thread north into the Concordia neighborhood, west of 27th, along Grand Avenue, and then Highland Boulevard. And you have the Pabst Sons building their mansions at about 30th and Highland. So Dad's on 20th, the boys, Gus and Fred Jr., are on about 32nd or so. And that was lined with the homes of especially wealthy German settlers, Brunders, Kiekefers, Usingers, Gellerman. So German that it was called in some circles Sauerkraut Boulevard. So this was the high end of the German aristocracy in Milwaukee. The next step out is Washington Heights, as you come out through Washington Park, and I'll talk more about Washington Heights. But you keep on following that thread, the Highlands, Wauwatosa, Elm Grove, Brookfield, town of Brookfield. So people way out there near Pewaukee, in these McMansions, don't probably pause to think about it very often, but you can trace the character of their settlement in one unbroken line, all the way back to 9th and Wisconsin. So fairly clear evidence of how history has staying power, how history is, as I define it, very much why things are the way they are. So Washington Heights took its place in that chain in the years around World War I. And before that time, your neighborhood had been an area of kind of gentleman farms. One was owned by a guy named George Dousman, a famous sort of a fur trading family in Wisconsin, not just in Milwaukee. He was a freight handler whose son kind of left the trade and went into the bottled water business at the Niskara Spring, which was right where the school is. So that the bluff there, that's where the water kind of issued out. They bottled that and sold it all over the country. And George owned most of the neighborhood between 51st and 60th. So he was the original owner of pretty much more than the western half of today's Washington Heights. And just beyond 60th was, in what's now the Highlands, was the summer home of Captain Fred Pabst and his family. His permanent house was there on 20th. He would go all the way out past 60th for the summer. Transportation being a bit different from what it is today. He raised, not just kids there, he raised hops for his brewery, and he raised horses, which ran the beer wagons for his brewery as well. In 1892, an observer visited Pabst's home and described it as an airy abode with all the charms of a castle on his beloved Rhine without the architectural inconveniences. Long gone. It was torn down long before I think they developed the Highlands. So that's kind of the foundational history of the Washington Heights landscape in the years after native settlement. Signs of urban development were clear as early as 1892, and that year is really important in the development of the Washington Heights neighborhood. 3 major changes occurred in that single year. The most important was the opening of this park. This opened as West Park in 1892. It had been purchased by the city, and it was not the County Park Commission, it was the City Park Commission. Back in those early years, they didn't merge until 1937, January 1st to 37. And it took a couple of years to begin development, but it was finally opened in 1892, and it became a Milwaukee showplace. It was characterized by carriage drives, a horse racing track right here behind the UEC, and it was not thoroughbred quarter horses, it was trotters. So that was kind of the way horse racing was done back in the later 1800s. And the lagoon, which was dug out from a pre-existing wetland, an observation platform at the high point from which you could see Lake Michigan, it was reported, especially when the leaves were off the trees. And the seeds of a zoo. Back in 1892, the first year the park opened, there was a gift made of 7 deer, 7 white-tailed deer, by Gustav Pabst. So the Pabsts are part of this thread going way back. And the park authorities enclosed a single acre as kind of a deer paddock, and that became the beginning of the Washington Park Zoo. It was ultimately on the west side, it's where 41 is. It runs right through, the ghost of the Washington Park Zoo. They would add features like Monkey Island, I think that took place in 1921. So there were things that some of us of a certain age still recall. You have got to be up there in years to recall the zoo in its prime, but that became a metropolitan and even regional tourist attraction. So it was in many ways to the west side of Milwaukee what Lake Park was to the east side, and both designed by the firm of Frederick Law Olmsted. Same guy did Central Park in New York. So got very distinguished landscape architecture right here on the west side of Milwaukee. And what Washington Park did was what parks always do. They raised property values in the surrounding neighborhood, became a magnet for development, people coming out here to be close to the green space, and certainly encouraged park-like development in the surrounding area. Where do the boulevards come from? They're absolutely tied to this park. Washington goes west and Sherman goes north. And it was intended to be kind of the nexus of that boulevard system. And the next step out is Sherman Park, north of us along Burleigh, and kind of the park-like setting of the Highlands to the west of 60th. Same thing's going on the east side, Newberry Boulevard, links Riverside and Lake. So that was very intentional. We call them the lungs of the city. That's what we call them, kind of environmental corridors today. But the intention was to create corridors of green space that would link larger units of green space. You see some great examples right here on Milwaukee's west side. Other changes in 1892, Wauwatosa incorporated as a village. It actually went way back to 1837. It's one of relatively few Milwaukee suburbs that actually had an independent existence before they became dormitories for city residents. Began as a little trading settlement called Hart's Mills, when a Yankee named Charles Hart put his mill at the rapids of the Menominee River, right there in Wauwatosa Village. So they incorporated in 1892, and they took in the old Pabst farm, came east to 60th, and added mass to this developing corridor. And in 1919, as part of Wauwatosa, the Highlands became the Highlands as you know them today. There's a persistent legend about the Highlands were supposed to have been something called Kaiser Wilhelm Platz, developed by a landscape architect who was a loyal German. And what was going on in 1919? World War I had ended the year earlier, and who were on the losing team there? It was Kaiser Wilhelm, Kaiser Bill. So the chances of that happening were very remote. The legend is that the architect got his revenge by laying out the drives there to resemble a Prussian soldier's helmet, complete with a little spike, up and around Lloyd. But the chances of that happening are quite slim. It would have been like calling a post-World War II subdivision Hitler Heights, which probably would not have gone very well. So 1892, Washington Park opens, Wauwatosa incorporates, and the same year a streetcar line went in along Lloyd. And that was subsidized by the Pabst family. This was a means of them and their neighbors to get back into town. And it linked prospective home seekers with jobs in the heart of Milwaukee and people in Wauwatosa as well. So that's, among other reasons, that's why Lloyd's a little bit wider. And it's why you have some lingering storefronts on Lloyd. That was kind of a commercial thoroughfare in a minor way compared to North or Vliet, but that goes back to the 1890s when that was a streetcar corridor. So 1892, you have those three things taking place. Washington Park opens, Wauwatosa incorporates, and the Lloyd Street streetcar line goes in. And they had a formative influence on Washington Heights by opening the door to settlement. All these kind of conspired to bring people out into what is now Washington Heights. The movement was somewhat muted at first, but the old Dousman farm was subdivided, and piece by piece it was offered for sale. The boom began in about 1910 and went on without interruption until 1930. If you do the numbers, nearly all of today's homes, almost 95%, in Washington Heights were built between 1910 and 1930. Does that kind of jive? Your experience? And the majority were built between 1915 and 1925. So that single decade after World War I, that was the formative decade for the architecture and the street network, everything you see in the physical landscape of Washington Heights today. So the attraction was fairly clear. But there was an ad from 1911, and this is kind of the beginning of urban settlement in Washington Heights, and it was advertising the virtues of the High Mount subdivision. And it was not just High Mount Boulevard, it went from 48th to 53rd, so it was a pretty wide swath in the heart of the neighborhood. And the ad began with a piece of enduring wisdom: the foundation of home values is location. The old line, location, location, location. And it went on, get the right location at the right price, and your buy will be safe and sure. Your home will make money for you while you live in it. Have we heard that before? High Mount is the right location on high ground 1 block west of Washington Park, one of the finest parks in the city. Only 25 minutes from the Grand Avenue Bridge on the cars, streetcars. Reasonable building restrictions, and I'll talk about those in a minute, and beautifully parked streets. So the advertisement was green space, kind of out on the edge, but with easy access to the heart of town. Those developers found takers, and who were they economically? They were a mix of well-to-do and middle-income homeowners. Teachers, tool and die makers, contractors, clerks, mailmen, salesmen. But the ones who really stood out were the wealthier residents. People with names like Trecker, machine tools, Galoon, tanning, Steinman, lumber, Gettleman, brewing, Brumder, publishing, and then a Harley and a Davidson as well in Washington Heights. And a lot of them came from the Concordia area. So they kind of moved in one jump from the area east of 35th out here to Washington Heights, coming through Washington Park. And that extended that chain of settlement from the 9th in Wisconsin out to the north and west. A greater number of those wealthier West Siders moved to the east side in the teens and 20s when the automobile became popular. And who buys it first? People who could afford it. So that mobility allowed a lot of them to move to the east side, which became kind of a metropolitan Gold Coast. But there was also significant influence in the push westward from Washington Park. And there was one sign of that. One deed restriction in the Highmount subdivision's properties was that the owners had to build homes that were worth at least $3,500. That was the ante. That was the entry-level home in a large section of Washington Heights. In ethnic terms, the people who settled here were very largely German. And the names indicated, like the Gellemans and the Steinmans and the Trekkers, among others. Their largest church, St. Sebastian's, was an offshoot, was a daughter congregation of St. Michael's on 24th and Cherry. And that was a hugely important north side German establishment. St. Seb's began in 1911 in a Vliet Street storefront that's now a bar. It's the Wonder Bar. That's where St. Seb's began. And there were also German Lutheran congregations. Mount Olive, almost across the street from Seb's, begins in 1923, a Missouri Synod congregation. And 60th St. James, Wisconsin Synod in 1921. So it kind of tracks the years of development for the neighborhood as a whole. There were also some Irish families here, and a number of Jewish residents in the northeast corridor. Northeast very corner of Washington Heights. And the movement there is from the area around where the Hillside Housing Development is. They're right around 6th south of Walnut. And that area at one time was the Eastern European Jewish center of settlement. There were at one time around 1900, 5,000 people there in a dozen synagogues. Among them was a young woman named Goldie Mabowez, who became later on Golda Meir. And the movement there was north and west, and the main movement was up into Sherman Park. Burleigh Center became kind of the synagogue rows, and Beth Yehuda is still there. But in 1923, there was Beth El congregation that located on 49th and Garfield. That was the first synagogue in Milwaukee west of 13th Street. So this is kind of the movement out of the Jewish population. It was also the very first conservative congregation in the entire city. Before then it had been Reform and Orthodox, and conservative kind of offer sort of a middle way between those two. Whatever their backgrounds, Washington Heights was a major point of departure from the neighborhoods those people who moved here had known before. In a look at the neighborhood, some things are fairly clear. It was developed at a time when planning preceded building. Before that time, it was kind of anything went. Washington Heights has a great deal more order. The setbacks are more uniform. You've got boulevard development. Tree plantings were done in an orderly fashion. And that has become a major amenity of Washington Heights. They had the foresight not to plant just elms. When those were wiped out, it just denuded and denatured, literally. Those scores, hundreds, thousands of Milwaukee streets. And you still have these cathedrals of trees in Washington Heights, certainly one of the major amenities in summer as well. The homes were also developed to reflect a measure of success. The soundness of the housing stock in Washington Heights is pretty self-evident. And importantly, it was also developed at the start of the automobile era. The teens and 20s is when the automobile is finally becoming, especially among those who could afford it, middle income and above, the conveyance of choice. So the homes were built with garages. You know the size of the garages in your alleys? You know, they're be pretty hard to get more than a Volkswagen in most of those, but those are, in most cases, they were developed at the same time as the houses themselves. So this was an automobile-oriented extension of the older part of Milwaukee. So in short, it was something like the suburbia of the teens and 20s in the city of Milwaukee. A purely residential enclave, no industry here at all. Nestled between the city to the east and Wauwatosa to the west. It was, some people called it the Hidden Heights, and I'm glad to be so. back in those early years. Comfort and relative seclusion were important reasons that people settled in your neighborhood. The neighborhood it most resembles, you all know, is Sherman Park. Built around the same time, and the same rational development plan, the same predominance of bungalows, they're both kind of bungalow heaven. The same tree-lined streets, they also had more Norway maples and elms in their urban forest. The main differences are that Washington Heights is more compact and has closer contact with green space. You've got Washington Park right here, and Whitfield to the south, and Menominee Parkway not too much farther to the south as well. So about as soon as development was done in 1930, the big freeze came. The Depression begins and nothing's happening. Development is absolutely at a standstill. And that lasted from 1930 until 1945. The only physical change of note was the band shell right here, given by Emil Blatz, the brewer. And that was installed in 1938. So that was a signal development of the Depression when nothing else was going on. The big changes occurred in the years after World War II in the society and certainly in the neighborhood. Among them was the freeway that was plowed through the west end of Washington Park in the late 1950s. And what that meant obviously was the zoo was solid gone. It went out to 100th and Blue Mound. And I talked to some of the older residents back when I was doing the poster the first time, and they said, you know, not everybody missed that zoo. You know, when you have a west wind, the smell of the elephants, they kind of settle like a pall on much of the neighborhood. You also had, in the years after World War II, the population aged as those first residents moved into retirement or passed off their mortal coil, and their kids in many cases moved farther west. By 1960, the median age of the Washington Heights census tracts was 8 years above the city median. So it was quite an older neighborhood than existed elsewhere in the city. The next stage was pretty obvious by the 1970s. Younger families, many with small kids, who were attracted by the area's convenience and its obvious amenities, moved here in droves. By 1980, the median age was just a few months above the city median. So in a relatively short period, you can see the demographic profile change pretty clearly. Housing values were also above the city median. Washington Heights also became more diverse in the more recent past. The most recent group who has played a role here is African Americans. Their movement began in the 1960s and has gathered momentum. In 1985, African Americans made up roughly 5% of Washington Heights population. In 2010, which is the last good data year, the ratio was about 25%. So just like the early Germans, they have moved from the north side to the greener pastures of Washington Heights. It is the same movement, and it comes from the same place and motivated by the same reasons. From the very beginning of settlement in Washington Heights, the area has represented the very best housing its residents could afford. Whether they buy or rent, the pattern is identical for African Americans in the early 21st century as it was for German Americans in the early 20th century. So a great deal of continuity along with that change. I've been looking at numbers to try to figure out how Washington Heights has moved from the base when I was first poking around here in some depth in the mid-1980s. I've also been doing some reading and riding my bike. I spent a couple days, Monday and Tuesday this week, doing a handlebar survey of your neighborhood, just talking to folks, kind of observing the landscape, and talked to probably 25 or 30 of you and your neighbors, short or long conversations about how things are going. And certainly the conclusions I've reached from this highly unscientific survey would include these. Certainly you have increased diversity, but you also have a preponderance of people who see diversity as an asset, who value diversity. And I think the more brittle among you seem to have either moved off the earth or moved west. the ones who remain certainly have an appetite for city life, have an appetite for engagement with the city life. I also encountered a uniformly high level of resident satisfaction. Usual concerns, you all expect them, crime and property values, here as elsewhere, are things that people track, people pay attention to. But people use the word love about this neighborhood with heartening frequency. Say, I love this home, I love this neighborhood, I love my neighbors, I love living here. And that was a strong conclusion from one corner to the other of the entire neighborhood. There have also been some obvious physical changes. You've got more businesses on Vliet Street than were here back in the 1980s, including a couple of fine restaurants and a personal favorite, Cold Spoon's Gelato. There have also been some highly visible and major improvements to this park. The new playgrounds, the soccer fields, the stabilization of the shoreline with Harley's help, new life for the Temple of Music, and perhaps the most formative of all, the Urban Ecology Center. And certainly we've talked about the tragedy that took place an hour before I went through here on my bike, or an hour after I went through here on my bike on Monday. But you can't let a random tragedy discourage you from noticing and celebrating all the positive things that are going on here as well. Here at UEC, and I would describe that this center is probably the single most formative, positive influence in the park in recent decades. It's like the old days. Some of us recall when the county parks actually had program staff on site. But in this case, UEC operates year-round and interacts aggressively with schools within a 2-mile radius of its center. So it has certainly actively engaged the neighborhood, and the neighborhood has certainly returned the favor. My favorite indicator I noticed in the landscape poking around this week, did a really careful count, and a nice ratio emerged. You have one single boarded-up house in the entire neighborhood and 7 little free libraries. Certainly a positive change in the recent past. I took some and left some as well. Other changes since the mid-1980s, you have a mayor living here, returning to his roots, a DCD commissioner, a library director, the mayor's chief deputy, and a library deputy director. It does not hurt to have people in high places among your neighbors. But most important of all, you have a neighborhood association that did not exist when I was poking around here for the poster back in the mid-1980s. WHNA was established in 1990, so you were coming up on a quarter century of involvement. That's an achievement. That's something that you should celebrate as a group. This association promotes a sense of identity. It reflects an obvious sense of pride and embodies a determination to build on your common strengths and to work on solutions to your common problems. There certainly have been changes in Washington Heights since the mid-1980s, but I'll close by saying what impresses me most is the constants, the things that haven't changed in a very long time. For residents of all backgrounds, whether they're newcomers or third-generation homeowners, the attractions of Washington Heights are identical to those that emerged in the very first years of settlement here, going back nearly a century. You have one of the highest concentrations of solid, carefully built housing in the entire city. You have solid institutions, beginning with churches, extending to Urban Ecology Center, and certainly the Washington Heights Neighborhood Association. You have a solid blend of urban diversity and convenience, and suburban privacy and comfort. And you have a solid sense of community. You know what you have here, and you are determined to preserve it. So solid is still the word that most aptly describes Washington Heights. You are a solid member of the larger community, and the Heights has a continuing high profile in the confederation of neighborhoods that together make up Milwaukee. Larry says we have time for questions, correct?
Yes, a few minutes.
A few minutes. Anything that I can This is your neighborhood. I should be asking you, yeah.
I am kind of curious, because with the way the houses are built, mine was 49. Is there a resource to figure out what was there before the house was built?
In 1949?
Yeah, I mean, it's the short end of a block, so I'm assuming nothing, but there's a corner grocery store. I know there's a Porter family on the other corner, and there's 2 little houses.
Yes, the answer is yes. And Central Library, the Humanities Room, has a wonderful collection of sandbore maps, which were done by fire insurance companies to rate fire risk. So they'll tell you where the nearest hydrant is, whether they're masonry or wood, how far apart they are. And those go back to the 1870s, and the last update, I think, is 1956. And they're paste-on, so you can kind of see they're really expensive to produce. So they wouldn't do a new edition every year, but they would kind of paste on what was there. So you can go back, and you find a helpful librarian in humanities who can kind of show you how to use those. It's fairly intuitive, but yes, you can trace that back. Another way to do it is the city directories, which are also downtown at the Central Library. Beginning in 1921, there's a reverse directory, and you can go down every street and see who lived at every single address. This is a lot of fun. And if your address isn't there, no, your house wasn't there. In 1930, the address numbering system changed, so you have to kind of do the translation, but it's not that hard. So you have a good resource. You want to add to that, Paula?
Yeah, just that I think at least 2 to 4 times a year we offer a class at Central Library called House History, and it's extremely popular, and we can help you answer those questions. So you can go back and find out who owned your house and all the things that you're interested in. And the 2 resources that John mentioned figure prominently into that research.
There's really cool stuff down there.
It is.
Well, and it's kind of neat, because under the stairs going down, one of the stairs actually has, I think it's Badger Builders, and it's like just one of the slats. It's like, I Googled them, trying to find, I can't see anything on them. It's like, well,
That's fun though, isn't it?
oh yeah.
Yeah, it's addictive. Yes, sir.
Was Lloyd Street called Pabst Avenue?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. Yes.
Do you know why it was changed?
To be honest, no. And there's a really good book by Carl Baer called Milwaukee Street Names and the Stories Behind Them.
Check that out. It gives information about Lloyd that was named after, but
Not why they changed it.
not that it was even Pabst before that.
It'd be interesting to know if it took place before or after the area came into the city of Milwaukee. What they may have been doing was making it conform with Lloyd Street to the east. So early on, when it was a neighborhood that was developing somewhat independently, and that happened a lot in Milwaukee, they would change names that had been sort of just kind of one-offs for these little small sections of town and make them conform to the larger grid. That may have been going on. Only a theory. Yes, sir?
Yeah, I got a question. If I could have a point of interest for our area, like a sign, what happened here, where would it be in our neighborhood that we could have a point of interest of a historic point?
Well, it probably wouldn't be an event. Probably it wouldn't be the Teddy Roosevelt shooting. It wouldn't be MacArthur coming
a
through.
house or something that was there, I don't know.
Niskara Spring, you could do Niskara Spring certainly. You could certainly do Sebs, but then you want to do all the churches. Larry, you have a suggestion there? The Wonder Bar.
Which was the original Sebs, right?
Where was I on Sunday morning? I was at church.
I think we do have some great streets, Washington Boulevard and Highmont, that have plaques on the houses, but I know what you're saying, the specific location.
Designation.
Yeah.
For instance, in Merrill Park, Playfield, right on Clyburn and 35th, there is a historical marker that says Merrill Park. And it kind of tells the story of the neighborhood. In Bayview, on the corner of Russell and Superior, there is a historical marker that tells the story of the Bayview Rolling Mill, which is why the neighborhood is there.
Yeah,
So,
what would we do for here? We do springs or something? I don't know.
just Springswood or some, just information talking about kind of the basic pattern of how it developed and why and when, and the fact that it is a remarkably intact example of 1910 and 1930 architecture in town. Things you could do, yes sir?
I'm wondering if you have any insight on the state of Wisconsin budget issue with the residency requirement?
Do I?
Yeah. It passed the finance committee tonight that cops and firefighters are required to live within 15 miles. Like, that came up on Twitter.
Just today?
That was just passed like literally 30 minutes ago on the finance committee. So.
No, I get to do a column on the first Sunday of each month in the Journal, and a month and a half ago it was a fairly pointed defense of the city of Milwaukee and saying residency is something that the city needs. And sort of keep your hands off. I got 450 online responses, which I have yet to read and will not. Yes, sir.
When you were talking about housing in the area, one thing you didn't mention was the Milwaukee duplex.
Right.
That seems to be pretty popular type.
You don't have that many Milwaukee duplexes in the classic sense. You've got more single families. There are certainly duplexes, but the typical, the really kind of conventional Milwaukee duplexes, largely 1900 to 1910. And the area east of you, east of the park, that has a whole lot of duplexes. And that was kind of, in some ways, associated with the German population. You fill up the whole yard with house, and then the tenant pays the house payment. So that was kind of the operating idea. So east of the park, obviously, you have more density and more duplexes, but you certainly have more the period revival and the bungalows, that were the signature homes of the era in which Washington Heights was being developed. Hey, yes, ma'am.
I work here in the park, and one of the questions that I get asked really often is about the elephant buried somewhere. Is that a true thing, or is that a...
Tell the kids it's in the mound up here above the lagoon. I am not aware, that there is an elephant graveyard here in Washington Park. That would seem unlikely, I would say. Really? Can anyone shed light on that? Anyone know where the bodies are? That'd be a big grave. Yeah.
I did a study about 15 years ago for the Washington Park, and at that time we were collecting postcards from people, and I got a lot of postcards of the zoo, and I had heard that too from people that had given over the postcards that they had buried elephants in the park. So, not valid, but...
No, that would be a fun activity, to do a little dig in Washington Park. I do know that during the Depression there were proposals to, people are not necessarily starving, but they were having really a hard time staying nourished, and there were proposals to take some of the heavier eaters in the Washington Park Zoo and convert them into food. So that was, it didn't go anywhere, fortunately, but it shows you how hard-pressed Milwaukee was at the time. Yes, ma'am?
Maybe two more questions. Sorry.
Okay.
Just two more.
Do you know what year exactly it was that it moved from here to out on Blue Mountain?
I'm guessing about 1960, when?
I was 6 and it was 153, what is it?
59?
Yeah. In the late 60s, because I was living in this neighborhood, and that was right about the time I graduated from grade school. So
Mid to late 60s, is when it would have taken place. And the real big change there, we kind of take it for granted today, is if you recall the old Washington Park Zoo, it was like zoos everywhere, and the model was kind of zoos as jails for animals. Bars and the crescent-shaped, kind of blades, actually. So the Milwaukee County Zoo was among the very first in the country to have what they called habitat enclosures, which they're still captive, but it was at least a means to kind of represent or suggest or evoke, the natural habitats of those animals. That was a big deal, back in the 1960s. One last question, Keith.
So, three streets I've always been curious about the name or why. Who is the lead? Was Lisbon, Trail, and North Avenue? Why is it North Avenue?
In order, Garrett Vliet was a surveyor. So he was here way back in the 1830s, and Vliet Street's named for him. It begins way downtown, so that's the origin. It kind of comes out here. What was the second one? the north.
Lisbon,
Lisbon Avenue, it's really, when you look at the landscape, it makes perfect sense. Any street that is diagonal in Milwaukee or other places, Chicago's the same animal. Milwaukee Avenue on the north side. It was most likely a plank road that linked the market in Milwaukee with the farm producers out in the country. And it went out to the town of Lisbon, which is the area around Menominee Falls today. You know, so that's where it went. Watertown Plank Road, same thing. Green Bay Avenue went to Green Bay. Appleton went to Appleton. So Lisbon's named after the town. And North Avenue, you hear some discussions. North Avenue was actually, when Milwaukee incorporated as a city in 1846, North Avenue was the northern limits of the city. So that's the very end. There are other people who think it might be another surveyor, named after a guy named, I think it was Alex North, but somebody with the last name of North. So Vliet's a surveyor, Lisbon's a town, and North is, at the very least, a cardinal direction. Okay, thank you all, and keep up the good work.